Good evening and welcome. Thank you all for braving the elements to be here with us tonight. My name is Bob McClure and I'm the President and CEO of the James Madison Institute. We have been around for nearly 30 years and are focused on the principles of free markets, limited government, and personal responsibility. And while we believe truly in those principles, we also believe passionately in a need for open dialogue, hence the debate tonight. And an open dialogue about the issues facing our nation are incredibly important, and that's why we wanted to host it here and to have some folks that I'm going to introduce to you, and Mary Ellen will introduce to you as well, to highlight the differences in opinion. It's the greatness about this country is that we can have honest and sincere and passionate debate. And so thank you all again for joining us. We'd like to welcome all of you. Today, obviously, is tax day, and we thought there would be no better time to host a debate entitled Money, Politics, and the IRS. What's the future of your charitable giving? And so that's what we'll be doing tonight. We're grateful to our participants who braved the elements to be here as well. Dr. Craig Holman from Public Citizen, Hans von Spakovsky from the Heritage Foundation are with us tonight. You'll hear more about them in just a couple of minutes. And then we also have a very distinguished moderator, Mary Ellen Klas, who's the Capital Bureau Chief of the Miami Herald and Co-Bureau Chief of the Tampa Bay Times / Miami Herald here at the Tallahassee Bureau. And we're just grateful that they could join us tonight. We also have some partners. It's quite a mix, and I would invite you, if you haven't yet visited their tables, if you would do so afterwards. I think you'll learn a lot. It's in the spirit of tonight's open dialogue, we have folks from many sides of the political spectrum, and I'd like to briefly introduce them as well. We have the Village Square from here in Tallahassee, Young Americans for Liberty, the DeVoe Moore Center here at Florida State, United Partners for Human Services, Turning Point USA, the College Libertarians here at Florida State, and the Florida State University College Republicans. Please join me in giving all of them a round of applause. Now I'd like to ask Mary Ellen to come forward, and as she does so, I want to say just a little bit more about her. She has a long history here in the state of Florida. As I said, Miami Herald, Tampa Bay Times, but she also has had a career with Florida Trend and has been involved in politics in the state of Florida for many, many years. A graduate of the School of Journalism at Columbia University and also a graduate of the University of St. Catherine in St. Paul, Minnesota. So please join me in welcoming our moderator for the evening, Mary Ellen Klas.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Dr. McClure. That was, it's really a pleasure to be here. This is such an important debate and such an important issue. And I hope that we'll have some invigorating discussion. Our two debaters tonight, I did a little research on them, and there was actually a blogger who described them as, in a previous debate they have had, described it as a epic takedown between two top nemesis. And I'm thinking, whoa, that sounds pretty tough. So who knows what we're in for here tonight. But let me just give you a little background on these distinguished gentlemen. Dr. Craig Holman is the government affairs lobbyist for the Public Citizen. He serves as the organization's lobbyist on campaign finance and governmental ethics. Previously, he was a senior policy analyst at the Brennan Center for Justice at the New York University School of Law. Dr. Holman has been a researcher and an expert witness on behalf of the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act and has testified about campaign finance reform laws in Alaska, or about laws in Alaska, Arkansas, California, and Colorado. He's also testified before the U.S. Congress, the European Commission, and the European Parliament. Hans von Spakovsky is the manager of the Election Reform Initiative and the senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation's Edwin Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. His work focuses on campaign finance restrictions, enforcement of federal voting rights laws, protection of the integrity of campaigns and elections. And Mr. von Spakovsky is a former member of the Federal Elections Commission. His analysis and commentary have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Times, Politico, and Human Events. And he is the author of a recently published book, Obama's Enforcer, Eric Holder's Justice Department. So please give us a warm round of applause to welcome Mr. Holman, Mr. von Spakovsky. Thank you. Thanks. Well, I wanted to just kind of frame the question we're going to discuss tonight a little bit. Why are we here? Well, in the last election cycle, we saw a surge in so-called dark money groups, nonprofit organizations that under the IRS Code can engage in lobbying and political activity but do not have to disclose their donors. In response to this trend, the IRS has faced a stream of new applications from nonprofit organizations seeking designations as 501c4s, C5s, C6, and among them are some familiar names. Most recently, we've heard about the Right to Rise Policy Solutions, which is affiliated with Jeb Bush. We've heard of Priorities USA, which was in 2012 affiliated with Obama. There's a group out called the 60 Plus Association, which has done a lot of work and spent a lot of money trying to benefit conservatives, and it's sort of the counterpart to AARP. So according to the Center for Responsive Politics, spending by organizations that do not disclose their donors has increased from less than $5.2 million in 2006 to over $300 million in the 2012 election. Now, while these are not charitable organizations and donations are not tax deductible, they do enjoy the benefit of being tax exempt. They also do not have to disclose the identity of their donors. So individuals, corporations, and unions can give as much as they want to these organizations while remaining anonymous. Political committees, however, don't enjoy these same benefits. Political committees, we have established the tradition of disclose and report. So where are we? We've got one announced candidate for president from Florida, and I think we'll likely have more. The cost of campaigning is growing exponentially as the so-called arms race for contributions spirals, and the IRS is preparing the release of a new rule aimed at governing the political activity of these nonprofit groups. The intent of the rule, supposedly, is to clarify how much these organizations can participate in political campaigns without being considered a political organization. So the question is, should these nonprofit organizations be treated differently? Is this free speech or is it political advocacy? We will address all those issues, and I think both of our participants tonight are ready for this. We're going to start off with some opening arguments, then we'll have a series of rebuttals, and then each gentleman will present his closing arguments, and then we'll follow with questions from the audience. So, shall we start? Should the government regulate nonprofit organizations that engage in politics, and if so, how? Mr. von Spakovsky, could you start?
Okay, I'll go first. Thank you very much for inviting us down, and good evening to everyone. Craig and I were actually over there speaking about the remark you made about our last debate, saying there was an epic takedown, and what we were wondering was who took down who.
So who was the epic takedown?
What the answer was.
Must have been me. I know.
I actually think the name of this session ought to be changed to Forced Disclosure by Government Reporting versus Your Right to Privacy, Free Speech, and Freedom of the Press. Now, why do I say that? Well, let me ask a question, and this is something, I don't care which side of the political aisle you're on, whether you're on the right, the left, or the center, or an independent. This affects all of you. Let me ask a question of you. How many of you are members of or have donated to a membership organization like You know, the NAACP, the NRA, NARAL, Planned Parenthood, Americans United for Life, the Sierra Club, or perhaps a Tea Party organization. Okay, there's a lot of people in this room that have done that. These are organizations whose purpose is what? They're organizations where like-minded individuals can get together, put their resources together, and multiply their voices to speak on issues that are important to those individual Americans. Now, do you believe that you should have to report to the federal government all of your contributions, how many you made, which organizations you gave them to, so that the government can then put it up on the internet and the web, so that everyone can see the organizations you give money to, your neighbors, your employers, people on the other side of an issue who don't like those organizations and would potentially use that information to harass and intimidate you? I don't think so, and I don't think the government has the constitutional right to do that, because I think it violates basic First Amendment rights and 14th Amendment rights. Now let me read to you a quote. It's a little bit long, but I think it's useful for you all to hear this. This is from probably one of the most famous books written about democracy in America. 1835, Alex de Tocqueville, as you know, a Frenchman who came here to see how American democracy worked. And this is something that he said. Americans of all ages, all conditions, all minds constantly unite. Not only do they have commercial and industrial associations in which all take part, but they also have 1,000 other kinds: religious, moral, grave, feudal, very general and very particular, immense and very small. Americans use these associations to give fetes, to found seminaries, to build inns, to raise churches, to distribute books, to send missionaries out. In this manner, they create hospitals, prisons, schools. Finally, if it is a question of bringing to light a truth or developing a sentiment with the support of a great example, they associate. These intellectual and moral associations, as Tocqueville called them, are the organizations that we're talking about. The nonprofits that are supposedly full of fearsome, dangerous, dark money. Every time I hear that ridiculous term, I want to chant lions, tigers, and bears. Oh my. That term, by the way, is a term that was come up by a particular progressive organization as a result of focus groups, because they wanted to come up with a term that would just scare the American public and make you think of Darth Vader when they were talking about dark money. Forcing people to report to the government who they donate money to, which organizations they're members of, is going to do what? It's going to reduce speech. It's going to chill advocacy, because there are people who have differing views. Again, it doesn't matter whether you're on the left or the right. You know, there may be people who live in conservative neighborhoods that have liberal views that they're going to get in trouble with if they express them or people find out who they've given money to. There may be people who live in liberal neighborhoods that have conservative views who may get in trouble, lose a job, may get harassed and intimidated. Now, if you don't think that's going to happen, that's in fact something you should ask the former, I say former, CEO of Mozilla. You know, one of the biggest internet companies who was forced out of his job. Why? Because it was discovered that he had given $1,000 in a contribution to a referendum in California on Proposition 8, which is a proposition concerning gay marriage. We actually wrote a paper at Heritage over this very issue. In California, if you give more than $100 to a ballot referendum, so this is not a situation where you have candidates, where you're contributing to candidates, but a ballot referendum, you've got to report your name, how much you gave, and your employer. Now, there is no chance of corruption in that. You know, it's one thing to require disclosure of donations to candidates. Okay, you want to be sure that there's no quid pro quo going on, that there's no bribery going on, that a candidate, if they're elected, isn't doing something because they've been paid to do it. There's no possibility of that in a referendum. But you know what happened with modern technology is that some groups took the people who had donated on what they consider to be the wrong side of Proposition 8. They put them up on the web. They attached Google Map functions so that people could find out where these people lived and where they worked. And the results were donors had their homes, churches, and cars vandalized with spray paint, eggs, urine, broken windows, keyed and scratched cars, graffiti, including swastikas. Donors received harassing phone calls, emails, and mailings using vulgar language and making threats against them, including death threats. One email threatened to contact the parents of students at a school where a Proposition 8 donor worked. Another donor had a flyer distributed about him in his neighborhood, labeling him a bigot with his photo, his church, and the amount of his donation. The director of a nonprofit musical theater lost his job because of the disclosure of his donation. So did the director of the Los Angeles Film Festival. A 67-year-old waitress who gave $100 lost her job because her donation was made public. A boycott of her employer's restaurant was organized with protests in front of her. She was forced to make an apology and leave the restaurant. Now, I can speak out as much as I want to. You know, I have a job in Washington where I'm actually paid to speak my mind. It's the smaller donors who are going to be hurt, harassed, and intimidated if their private giving, the government forces it to become public. Now, there are these people who say, well, anonymity is wrong, that you should not be able to do that. I would remind you that one of the most famous pamphlets in American history, Common Sense, which helped galvanize the colonists to fight a revolution to make this a free country, that was published anonymously because Thomas Paine was afraid of harassment and possible arrest. The Federalist Papers were published under anonymous names for many different reasons, and one of the reasons was that at the time the framers believed and said that this was necessary because people who criticize the government or criticize those in power are subject to abusement and harassment. And I can tell you, there is no other reason for wanting to force nonprofit advocacy groups to publish their donors. Let me ask you all a question, okay? If you see a political advertisement, one that says, for example, listen, this piece of legislation on abortion is about to be voted on by the U.S. Congress. Please call Senator Rubio and tell him to vote this particular way on this. Do you really need to know who the donors are to Planned Parenthood to make your own judgments about that ad? If you see an ad on an issue or a candidate from other organizations, the National Rifle Association, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the AFL-CIO, do you really need to know who their donors are for you to make your own judgment about the content of that ad? No, of course you don't. But this is an attempt to do two things. One, to divert attention from the message to the messenger, and second, to make those names available so that those who don't like the message that a particular organization is putting out can harass, intimidate the donors, because if you dry up the resources of that organization, they will not be able to speak. Now, since I started with Alex de Tocqueville, I will end with him again on why associations, because that's what nonprofit advocacy groups are, why it's important that we protect private giving, because that is a constitutional right. And in it he said, there is nothing, according to me, that deserves more to attract our regard than the intellectual and moral associations of America. I agree with that, and I don't think the government has any business knowing who the donors are to private organizations. I don't care which side of the political aisle they're on. Thanks.
You should be scared of dark money. Dark money is anonymous campaign cash that is designed to influence how you are going to vote for our legislators, for our presidents, for even court justices. It is a critical source of information for voters to try to judge the merits of the campaign ads that are going to just swamp us in the 2016 elections. Let me emphasize, we are about to enter the most expensive, the darkest presidential election in history. The 2016 elections, we've already got, as Hans brought up earlier to me, Hillary Clinton claiming she's going to raise $2.5 billion just to run her campaign. We've got the Koch brothers who are talking about spending roughly $900 million, largely through nonprofits. We got Crossroads GPS, Karl Rove doing the same thing, League of Conservation Voters, Tom Steyer, promising to throw in hundreds of millions of dollars into our elections. Much of it goes undisclosed. One of the greatest pillars that makes our democracy work is transparency of money in politics. All we're talking about is transparency. And by the way, we're not talking about transparency for nonprofit groups that don't get involved in elections. We're just talking about those groups that are spending substantial sums in our elections. Americans of every political stripe, of every party, Republicans, Independents, Democrats alike, firmly believe in transparency of money in politics. Public opinion polls will consistently put that figure around 80% of Americans. Not only is public opinion behind wanting to know who's trying to influence our decisions and our votes, but so are the courts, including the Roberts Court of the Citizens, in my opinion, the infamous Citizens United decision. Justice Scalia, no liberal brand whatsoever, in Citizens United, really laid out the importance of having transparency of money in politics to democracy. He said, quote, requiring people to stand up in public for their political acts fosters civic courage, without which democracy is doomed. I do not look forward to a society of anonymous campaigns. This does not resemble the home of the brave. The courts have consistently upheld transparency, even when they've struck down every other type of regulation when it comes to campaign finance. Citizens United overwhelmingly upheld the transparency of money in politics. Justice Kennedy, who wrote the majority opinion, even talked about how he said, don't worry, I do understand this, our Citizens United decision is going to result in a large influx of new money into elections. But don't worry, because we have a system of full transparency. So Americans are going to know who's trying to influence their vote. Shareholders are going to know how the CEOs are dipping into the corporate till and spending that money. So as long as we have transparency, he could justify Citizens United. The problem is we don't have transparency. As a matter of fact, since 2010, we have now seen $600 million spent in our federal election that comes from unknown sources. We have no idea where this is coming from. It isn't just the NRA using $50 contributions of their members. What we're talking about since Citizens United is individuals or corporations or both contributing multi-million dollars secretly, anonymously, behind closed doors, doing the backroom dealing. And we have seen this huge influx of money, and we don't know where it's coming from. I mean, in Citizens United, it happened January 21, 2010. So the very first federal election we had after Citizens United, we saw a four-fold increase in outside spending, much of that from nonprofits. Four-fold increase. That was with corporations dipping their toes in the political waters, saying, can we really do this? We've never been allowed to do this before, you know, and they realize, yes, they can do it, and they can do it anonymously by funneling and laundering the money through a nonprofit. And so in 2012, we saw another fourfold increase in outside spending and the dark money that goes with it. This is money that seriously is anti our democratic system. It is in violation of what the courts have ruled is our constitutional right to actually know who's spending money to try to influence our decisions. It violates the very principle of what almost most Americans view as a central pillar of our democratic system. We have to rein this in, you know, just to show how important this is and, you know, how widespread the public opposition is. I think many of you have just heard, just a couple hours ago, some mailman flew a little helicopter under the front yard of the Capitol to deliver 535 letters to members of Congress saying, open up the books, get campaign finance laws back going, have transparency of money in politics. You know, I mean, this guy penetrated, you know, secure airspace, and he was able to fly in right into the Capitol delivering that. We're seeing that kind of public uproar happening everywhere. What we can do to approach this problem reasonably. First of all, I want to emphasize the Federal Election Commission is largely responsible for the dark money. The courts are not. The court did not justify dark money. What happened was the Federal Election Commission decided that they were going to change the transparency law. So even after the McCain-Feingold law of 2002, we had literally 100% donor disclosure in 2004 and 2006. The FEC changed the rule, saying, well, instead of having just disclose if you're a $1,000 donor to one of these electioneering campaigns, you only have to disclose donors who earmark their contribution to such an ad. Nobody earmarks their contributions for campaign ads. You give your contribution because you believe in what a group is doing. And so as a result, we immediately saw a decline in donor disclosure down to 50%, and now we've got $600 million in dark money. The IRS could step up to the plate. I want to talk about the IRS briefly because that is one of the subjects here. You know, the IRS is in an awkward position. They are charged with determining which groups have crossed the line into becoming electioneering rather than serving a social welfare purpose. And they apply an 11-point facts and circumstances standard to try to come to that judgment, which is a completely subjective judgment. That's what has resulted in the recent IRS scandal. What Public Citizen and many other groups are advocating is what we call the Bright Lines Project. We want to remove as much discretion of the IRS as possible in calling those shots by clarifying the language of what is political intervention by nonprofit groups in regulations or in the statute itself. Remove the IRS as much as possible from discretion in making that call. And if we can do that, we're going to go a long ways towards opening up the books on all this secret money in our elections. The IRS, by the way, is in the process of rulemaking right now. They probably won't come out with a rule on this issue until after the 2016 elections. The IRS Commissioner Koskinen knows it can be too politically sensitive, and so he wants to wait until after the election. But that's fine. I can understand that. As long as the IRS goes forward, clarifies the rules of what is political intervention and what is not, and helps all us nonprofits figure out what we can and cannot do.
Very good. Just to follow up, I'd like for you both to address this. Hans says that we've had forced disclosure, and that interferes with our ability to associate and you know, is part of the protections of our First Amendment. Craig says that we don't have enough disclosure, that the courts have upheld transparency, and that's now, it's against our democratic system to not really disclose it. But it all comes down to what should be disclosed and why should it be disclosed. And it seems to me that that's what the IRS is in the situation of trying to figure out. Can you both address this question of what is social welfare and how should the IRS regulate it, and should it regulate it?
What we're talking about here, look, most of the organizations I talked about before, the NRA, NARAL, all these advocacy organizations, they are qualified under 501c4 of the IRS tax code. What that means is that they are tax exempt. When you make a donation to them, it's not a charitable deduction, but they're tax exempt, and they ought to be tax exempt, because if you think about it, the money they get, membership dues, people like you and me who send money to join the NRA, the government, we've already been taxed on that money. So there's no reason, they're not profit-making entities, there's no reason for them to be taxed. They are, under 501c4, they are supposed to be concerned with pursuing social welfare. Now, I don't want to put words in Craig's mouth, but he and I have had this debate before. Craig doesn't believe that social welfare involves any kind of election-related activity. I completely disagree, and let me tell you why. I don't care which issue is important to you, and I don't care which side of that issue you are on, whether it's guns, abortion, or anything else. The government today, the federal government and state governments, are so powerful and reach into so many corners of American life that there isn't any issue like that if you want to change how that issue is treated, you have to change the way the government regulates it or the laws governing it. If your interest is in abortion, well, abortion is defined, whether you can do it, whether you can't, when you can do it. That's defined by state and federal law. So if you're an organization that is concerned with social welfare in that area, you've got to be concerned with, one, talking to legislators. There's nothing wrong with that. And you've got to be concerned with, for example, if you believe there are legislators who are bad on that issue, which is important to your social welfare objective, well then, of course, you should be able to tell your members, in this upcoming election, candidate A is good on this issue, candidate B is not good on this issue. So this idea that social welfare does not include political participation is just completely wrong. Civic participation is part of social welfare. I think the rules on this need to be very clear. I don't think the IRS should be doing what it did, and that we know it did when it targeted conservative organizations and put out a BOLO. Be on the lookout for organizations that said in their charters, in their purposes, that they wanted to teach people about the Constitution, or that they disagreed with the administration's policy on health care. The IRS was targeting those organizations saying, we potentially don't want to grant them tax-exempt status. That is not the business of the IRS. You don't want an agency with that much power being used for those kind of political purposes.
The rules indeed should be very clear, and we need to minimize the discretion of the IRS in deciding who gets targeted for political intervention activities. However, when it comes to the definition of social welfare, it's long been interpreted in the tax code as well as by the IRS, as well as by really just common sense, to exclude electioneering activity. Because I want to emphasize, this is a pillar of American democracy, is that when you start paying for ads and putting out a lot of money to pay for ads for or against candidates, to influence who you're going to vote for, to make you not like one candidate and like another candidate, to compose our government, That is defined as electioneering, and we have every right to know who is paying for that. We need to know who is behind those types of payments, those types of ads, in order to judge the merits of the ads. Otherwise, we can just be, easily conned by a generic ad campaign. I want to emphasize too, as a lobbyist, when I'm talking about dark money, it's only dark to you. It's not dark to the lawmakers who benefit. Us lobbyists use our authority and exercise this judgment to make sure we selectively inform the appropriate lawmakers how much money we put in to support their election. It's only the public that's in the dark, which shows how dangerous this is. One more point about social welfare, however. 501c4, the tax code, actually declares that C4s shall have as their exclusive purpose social welfare minus electioneering activity, exclusive purpose. Public Citizen filed a lawsuit with Representative Van Hollen against the IRS for not enforcing the way the law is written. We have since, and only temporarily, withdrawn our lawsuit because of the IRS rulemaking that is going on. It looks like the IRS might finally deal with this issue and clarify to all of us and all nonprofits what is social welfare and how much of it, how much electioneering may be permissible and how much may not.
So, Hans, can you talk a little bit about how if political participation is inherent in social welfare, what does that mean? How far does that go? Give us some examples of what's acceptable.
I'll give you a specific example. I'll tell you the whole problem with this horrible proposed IRS regulation, which I filed a comment criticizing, as did 160,000 other people. It was actually the largest number of comments the IRS had received over any proposed regulation in, I think, like 7 or 8 years. You all know the League of Women Voters, right? It's a nonpartisan organization. Well, they'd be in big trouble under this new IRS reg, but why? Because the IRS says that candidate-related election activity would include get-out-the-vote efforts. So even though they're doing it on a nonpartisan basis, they would consider that to be election-related activity. If a nonpartisan nonprofit decided that it's important for civic participation and other reasons to hold a candidate forum. In other words, they get all the candidates, for example, running for U.S. Senate in the state. They invite them all there. It's completely nonpartisan. They've invited everybody, and they just want the public to be able to see what these candidates say about different issues. That's election-related activity, and that would count against the election-related activity the organization could have. There's all kinds of just terrible things like that in there that would completely restrict the civic participation and civic opportunity of nonprofits. And I think that is a way of chilling speech and chilling civic participation in a way that is bad for American democracy. I just want to add something. Craig keeps saying there's this huge amount of dark money flooding elections. That is not true. In the 2012 election, there was $7.3 billion spent in total by all candidates, presidential candidates, congressional candidates, the political parties, political action committees. Of that amount, only $320 million was done by nonprofits. That's 4% of the amount. And every dime of that $320 million was reported to the Federal Election Commission, where I used to be a commissioner, by the organizations that did it. Planned Parenthood, the SEIU, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. They all had to file reports saying, here's how much we spent on an ad, an electioneering communication, and every single one of those electioneering communications had to have a disclaimer on it saying this ad was paid for by whatever the organization was. So this idea that people didn't know about this is simply untrue.
$320 million is a lot of money, and that's just in one election. And that, by the way, was in an election that is going to be heavily dwarfed by the dark money in 2016. By dark money, the fear is not knowing how much money is being spent in our elections. We sort of have a record of that. The fear is who is putting that money into our elections. We may know Crossroads GPS is going to spend, $100 million on our elections, but the question is, and what we need to know in order to have an informed electorate, is where did that $100 million come from? Is it coming from corporations that have a particular agenda in mind? Is it coming from foreign entities? Where is that money coming from? That is something we need to know. I also want to address Hans's first point, which really was he was slaying a straw man. When he's talking about the original IRS rulemaking, where 160,000 comments were submitted to the IRS, just about all of us agreed that the original proposal that the IRS came out with was not well-founded. It was not strong. Public Citizen opposed it. The League of Women Voters opposed it. Hans opposed it because it went overboard. It really did try to capture, at that point, things like, sponsoring public debates like this. And that is entirely inappropriate for the IRS to try to capture. So the IRS realized they made a mistake. They withdrew that proposal. And now they are in the process of trying to think through another proposal. And I want to add, by the way, of those 160,000 public comments that came into the first IRS rulemaking, a majority from organizations, 67% from organizations, actually wanted the IRS to go forward with rulemaking to clarify what is political intervention and what isn't, but just not do it the way that they had originally proposed. We want the IRS to clarify the rules. As a member, a lobbyist for a nonprofit, I'm forever under scrutiny, let me say, by my own litigation team that, worries, well, we're within 60 days of an election, Craig, don't criticize some lawmaker. And I'm saying that isn't what the rule is. Us nonprofits don't even understand the rules. And we don't want to allow the IRS the discretion of evaluating if we cross the line. We want bright lines, definitions put in the tax code itself and in the regulations. By the way, I've got some material on the back table that explains exactly what the Bright Lines Project is all about.
I'm glad you talked about the IRS at such length, because my question is, isn't the IRS supposed to be in the business of collecting taxes? Why are they in the business of being a referee on political activity? And should they be? Is this...
Well, I can answer that.
Okay.
It all goes back to Lyndon Baines Johnson. Okay, the whole reason the IRS is in the business of trying to figure out whether people are engaged in political activity is because in the late 1950s, Lyndon Johnson got upset because there were ministers at some churches who were telling their flocks that Lyndon Johnson was not a good guy and that they didn't think they should support him. And so Johnson pushed through the amendment that is the basis for everything we're talking about today. So the whole basis of this problem, the whole basis of what gave the IRS its power was a very partisan politico wanting to hurt people that were criticizing him in the political arena. That's where it comes from.
And if I could expand and somewhat disagree on that, the IRS is charged with enforcing the tax code. That's why they are thrust into this role. The tax code provides a special status for 501c nonprofits in which there is no tax liability And there also is no disclosure of donors because presumably these nonprofits are pursuing social welfare rather than electioneering activity. If they're pursuing electioneering activity, they're supposed to be into the category of Section 527, political organizations, and disclose their donors. The IRS is thrust in the middle of this because they are responsible for enforcing the tax code. We don't want them enforcing the election code. Quite frankly, the Federal Election Commission should step up to the plate on that. But the IRS is indeed responsible for making sure that organizations that want the benefits of being a nonprofit organization live by the rules of how the law defines nonprofit organizations. And one more point, I want to emphasize why it's become so much more important ever since Lyndon Baines Johnson, is the Citizens United decision in 2010. You know, there were some nonprofit groups like Americans for Job Security that I felt were abusing the tax code. They were almost exclusively, in my opinion, electioneering. And I had filed a complaint against them with the Federal Election Commission, but they never did anything on that. And with the IRS, and they never did anything on it either. But what's happened since Citizens United is we've seen a huge, huge influx of new money going through those nonprofit organizations. It used to be a little bit of a problem prior to 2010. It's now a tsunami. And everyone is looking forward to setting up their own nonprofit. Almost every presidential candidate, by the way, is tied to a nonprofit organization. You know, those who want to kick in all the really big independent expenditure bucks are really doing it largely through nonprofit organizations. It's become a huge problem since 2010. And so it's got to be addressed, or we're in danger of losing the principles of our democracy.
Hans, is there any area where you think that contributions to a political nonprofit should be not be anonymous, should be disclosed?
Well, again, I think it's easy for people to get confused. If you are a nonprofit and you engage 100% political activity, you do have to disclose all your donors. Okay? Political committees are what are called 527 organizations. So if you are a political action committee, you're a 527. If you're the committee that a senator forms to reelect herself, that's a 527. Any organization that spends 100% of its activity on politics, that is a committee that has to report all its donors. And I don't disagree with that. But the rule on organizations like NARAL and the NRA is that they can engage in some political activity, but it can't be the majority of what they do. It has to be less than 50%. So this idea that you've got organizations spending 100% of their money on political activities and they're not disclosing their donors, again, that is a canard. It is false. And the other thing that I've got to disagree with Craig on is he said, ooh, you don't know if foreign money is influencing American elections. That also is not true. Why? Because federal law strictly prohibits foreign corporations, foreign individuals from not only contributing to federal candidates, but from engaging in any political activity, including independent political expenditures. And when the Supreme Court issued its decision in Citizens United about independent political expenditures, it specifically said this does not affect the ban on foreign corporations and foreigners. And that provision is enforced. I know that because I spent 2 years on the Federal Election Commission, and we enforce that provision. So this idea that's constantly repeated that this allows foreigners to come in, that is simply not true.
That's a surprising degree of confidence in that the law is being followed, especially when there is no disclosure as to whether the law is being followed. When it comes to foreign money, we really don't know what's happening, because when groups like Crossroads GPS, Americans for Job Security, Chamber of Commerce for that matter, reports expenditures they made, they don't report where the money came from. We really don't know where that money is coming from. More importantly, I mean, Hans said, you know, well, any group that has more than 50% of their expenditures or 100% has to register as a 527 and report their donors. Well, first of all, no one's ever specified this 50%. That's something that Karl Rove just sort of clings to. The IRS has never said that is the threshold, and in fact, the law says it isn't the threshold. The law says you can only claim 501c4 if your exclusive purpose is social welfare. That's the law. And it comes to something like Karl Rove and Crossroads GPS, for instance. I recently filed a complaint against them because from everything I could see, they even passed that 50% threshold because they spent so much money on electioneering in the 2010 and 2012 elections that it just didn't add up. And when I filed this complaint with the Federal Election Commission, the FEC General Counsel agreed and documented that 56% of overall expenditures by Crossroads GPS was spent on federal election activity. Yet the FEC deadlocked and did not enforce the law. You can't just rely upon what the law says and say, therefore, there is no problem with dark money. I think every one of us here in the audience fully realizes dark money is overwhelming our elections. And I suspect most people, just like most Americans, according to public opinion polls, want to know where that money's come from. The idea of having a democratic system when the big financiers behind who gets elected are just in back rooms with the lawmakers and not letting us know what's going on, I just don't see how our democracy can survive that type of environment.
One last question, then we're going to open up for questions. So Craig, what is the harm in letting the League of Women Voters collect an anonymous donation from somebody so that they can do get out the vote efforts?
Could you repeat the question?
Okay, sorry. What is the harm in having the League of Women Voters collect an anonymous donation from someone or a group of people so that they can do get out the vote efforts?
There is no harm in doing that. I mean, I want to clarify once again that the disclosure that we're talking about, when we're talking about dark money, we're talking about electioneering activity. We're not talking about educational activity. We're not talking about social welfare. The League of Women Voters will entirely agree that, first of all, they don't get into electioneering. They don't run these campaign ads for and against candidates. What they do is they host candidate debates for public education purposes, which is social welfare. And if a group, a nonprofit group, is legitimately following its purpose and following the tax code and pursuing educational activity rather than promoting or supporting or attacking or opposing candidates for public office, then I do not call for a disclosure of that.
Then can you each give me your definition of what you think electioneering is? So let's give some examples to help us understand what is it exactly.
Electioneering is when you expressly advocate for or against a candidate. When you say you should vote for someone, you should vote against someone, you should support someone, you should not support them. That's electioneering. It's
not running an ad on behalf of or against an opponent of someone you favor?
No, I said that.
Okay, so
I said it's advocating for or against a candidate.
Okay.
Electioneering is way more than express advocacy. This is something that many who like dark money want to try to pretend is not part of electioneering. Prior to the McCain-Feingold law, one of the most successful pillars of the McCain-Feingold law was we went beyond this definition of express advocacy as electioneering, which means vote for, vote against, support, elect. That came from the 1976 Buckley decision, a footnote, I think it was footnote 52, as a matter of fact, in the Buckley decision, where the Supreme Court was trying to figure out, well, we want disclosure of electioneering ads, but we don't want disclosure of educational campaigns. So how do we distinguish the two? In a footnote, they said, well, if it uses any of the magic words, a vote for or elect, it's a campaign ad. If it doesn't use the magic words, it's not a campaign ad, and therefore not subject to disclosure. Well, that left a huge, huge loophole. When I was at the Brennan Center, we did a study called Buying Time, where we took a look at how accurate footnote 52 was in determining electioneering ads. We literally rented an old satellite that used to fly around and spy on Soviet submarines during the Cold War. Now it's just flying around out there not doing anything. So we rented that and monitored television commercials in the 2000 elections. And the type of ads we would see would be an ad, for instance, one against Al Gore, where this aired right up to Election Day, where it said, Al Gore wants to increase your gas taxes. Don't be gored at the pump. See, it never said vote for or vote against, but it is electioneering and designed to influence your vote. And so the McCain-Feingold law expanded the definition of electioneering to include electioneering communications as well. So it goes beyond express advocacy.
So in the last election cycle, there was a group out of Kentucky called the Kentucky Opportunity Coalition, and they spent ads not to promote Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, but to oppose his opponent. And those ads were never, the donors of those ads were never disclosed. Is that appropriate, social welfare?
What kind of an organization was it? Was it a political action committee? Because
No,
if it
I'm
was,
sorry.
they have to disclose that.
No, this was a nonprofit 501c4, right? So it's apparently listed by the IRS as the Kentucky Opportunity Coalition.
Well, if they spent a majority of their resources on political ads, then they violated IRS regulations. If
So
this
if
was
it was-
only a minor part of what they did, then they didn't violate the law, and they shouldn't have a problem because of that. Now, let me say something. This is very important. Craig was saying that this electioneering communications provision was just great, and it captured all these ads that didn't use express advocacy. Let me tell you what that provision said, which fortunately the Supreme Court threw out. It said that if you ran an ad on radio, TV, or satellite that mentioned the name of a federal candidate 30 days before a primary and 60 days before an election, that was an electioneering communication, and you're prohibited from doing that. Now, I want you to think about this. If you look at the votes held in Congress and you put them up on a chart, you'll notice that the number of votes they take keeps getting bigger and bigger as you get closer to an election. Now, you all know why that is. They want to schedule votes that they can then talk to the voters. We voted on this, we voted on that. What that means is that if a vote had been scheduled 2 weeks before the November election, and you, again, let's go back to the abortion issue. It's a bill regarding abortion rights. And you were either a nonprofit for or against it, and you wanted to run an ad that simply said, call Senator Rubio. This vote on this abortion bill is about to come up. Please call Senator Rubio and tell him to vote against the bill. Or call Senator Rubio and tell him to vote for the bill. You would have been violating the electioneering communications law that Craig thinks is just so great, because that would have been considered an election ad, even though nowhere in there were you telling people how they should vote. You were simply doing grassroots lobbying on an issue important to you, which is a First Amendment right. You know, the ability to petition the government for redress of grievances. Lobbying is a First Amendment right. That would be considered electioneering communications. You would have been prohibited from doing that. And I just think that is completely wrong. That is not electioneering communications that need to be regulated.
We are not talking about any prohibition when you want to run electioneering communications within 60 days attacking or opposing or promoting or supporting candidates. What we are talking about is it is indeed a campaign ad, and disclose where the money's coming from for that. You can go ahead and run those ads. That's perfectly fine. That's what many nonprofits do. But that is electioneering for or against a candidate. Don't get gored at the pump. It is electioneering. It's a campaign ad. And we have a right to know who's paying for that campaign ad. Now, I want to emphasize, even this Roberts Court, the Citizens United Court, has not invalidated the electioneering communications provision. In fact, it has preserved it. And it expects, and you can see in the Citizens United decision, it fully expects that groups that run electioneering communications are going to be disclosing where they got their money from. The court has not invalidated this. It's a narrowly tailored law that appropriately expands the definition of campaign ads and captures genuine campaign ads.
What do you mean they've preserved the law? They specifically said that the electioneering communications provision, which banned corporations and labor unions, and that's both profit and non-profit corporations, from running those ads, they were banned from doing it. That was thrown out. Yes, they preserved the disclosure requirements, but saying that they left it alone, that is simply not true.
Well, at least you admit they preserved the disclosure requirement and the language within the law. What they struck down was the ban on corporations helping finance electioneering communications.
And labor unions.
They admitted, by the way, that Citizens United is an electioneering communications group. And they kept that intact and expected that we get disclosure of the money behind that. The electioneering communications provision's still in the law.
Yeah, and what that means is that any nonprofit corporation and any labor union that runs an electioneering communication is going to file a detailed report with the FEC reporting exactly how much they raised and spent to do that.
Which is fine.
Well, does anybody have any questions? So I think we've got some mics, so if you could.
This question is for Dr. Holman. I counted at least 4 times you referred to a democratic system and democracy. Are we not a constitutional republic?
Yes, and perhaps I should be more careful in referring to our Republican form of government rather than democracy. But I do generically refer to them in the same sense. I want to emphasize, too, what I call democracy, or our Republican form of government, I consider a form of democracy, is based on the principle of equality. And in order to preserve that principle of democracy, or if you want to call it Republican form of government, we need to all be able to participate in this system if we want to keep it alive and healthy. And if we are shut out as to who's financing the campaigns that determines who we're going to vote for and who's going to be in our government, this is not a healthy form of democratic or Republican form of government.
Somebody else?
Hi, thank you guys for being here. My name's Tyler Houston. My question is for you, Dr. Holman. It seems as though you mentioned there's the danger to our democracy if there's non-disclosure where the money's coming from. I would argue that the media itself, the general media, the Fox News, the CNBCs, theirs are very polarized. You know where the money's coming from, etc. But my thought is we as citizens should probably read a little bit more beyond, do a little bit more of our own homework in order to see what the actual issues are and not just believe what the media is. So my question to you is, what is the danger of the non-disclosure, given the fact that my personal opinion is we should probably, as citizens, get more informed anyway, not just see some advertisement of get gourd at the pump. We should probably go online at this point or read a book or find a magazine or talk to some people that may be more informed and start asking questions. What does that really mean? What really is this tax policy? So how does the non-disclosure, prevent more of or cause more of an issue on the democracy that we currently have than the general media is doing right now?
Well, you correctly point out that many journalists, as well as other nonprofit groups like the Center for Responsive Politics, or someone brought up the Sunlight Foundation earlier, does a great deal of work trying to uncover who's behind this dark money. And sometimes they can find it. Just sometimes, though. Not usually. We really don't know where most of this dark money is coming from, even with the great journalistic work that we've seen some do. There's been a great deal of trying to figure out where the Koch money is coming from, and even though they can track it down to some of these nonprofit groups, it turns into this huge network where everybody just kind of throws up their hands at the end. This is what we face. I mean, if we were all these very diligent journalists, we still wouldn't even open up the books on where this dark money is coming from. But most of us don't even have the time to do that. Most of us we're doing our jobs, we're living our lives, we're working with our families. We don't have the time to do that sort of intense investigative journalism to try to uncover where this money is coming from. And even those who do have the time are not able to crack open much of that dark money. We really don't know where this money is coming from.
Can I say something about it? Let me ask a question for all of you. How many of you vote? I don't want to embarrass anybody, but how many of you voted in either the 2012 or 2014 election? Okay, good. We have good civic participation here. Now, I want you to be honest when I ask you this question. How many of you, before you went into the voting booth and cast your ballot, before you made your decision on who you were going to vote for president, who you were going to vote for Congress, if there was a congressional race, how many of you first went to the website of where I used to be a commissioner, the Federal Election Commission, and looked up to see who had given money to the candidates that you were going to have to choose from? Now, be honest. How many of you did that? Not, okay. Almost no one in this room. That's how important disclosure, which Craig keeps talking about, was to all of you. Not.
Now, Hans, I want to interject here because having devoted a couple decades of my life to covering legislation, it seems to me that there is value in disclosure when it comes to votes on certain issues. Before, if we know that somebody has been heavily influenced by the teachers union and it's a vote on what's going to happen with their retirement benefits, it helps us, it informs us as to whether they're approaching this,
Well, I'm not going to argue with you. I mean, the argument today is about nonprofits, okay, not candidates. And I support disclosure of contributions to candidates. But let me tell you, the First Amendment right to speak, the right to free associations, all in the First Amendment, which is the same place that the press freedom is that you operate under. It certainly would, don't you think it would help me in judging the credibility of your stories if I knew the names of the anonymous sources you use? And yet journalists do everything they can to say, no, they can't do their job. They can't provide information without protecting those anonymous sources. Well, that same constitutional right that media folks assert is the same right that nonprofit advocacy organizations have who are out there trying to speak on issues that are important to all of their members.
I don't know if you want to defend yourself.
No, I mean, when it comes to anonymous sources, I don't think that's the same argument in that it's very rare that they get used, but we are also not elected.
You must not read the Washington papers.
Yeah, well, it's in my paper they're not used. But let me just tell you, when it does, the bottom line point here, though, is that if you want to influence somebody, is it possible to do that anonymously in the political process? And you're saying no, that this is just a natural.
There's two things. One, and I want to emphasize this, I've said it before. Anybody who runs a political ad, there's going to have to be a disclaimer on it telling you whether it was the SEIU, the AFL-CIO, the U.S. Chamber, which tells me what I need to know about those organizations to judge the message.
Now, what about the Kentucky Opportunity Society or Americans for Job Security? Who's funding them?
Well, Karl Rove doesn't hide his involvement, for example, with Crossroads. You keep using him as the devil in all this because you know it upsets people. The same way you keep bringing up the Koch brothers because they spend so much money trying to influence things. Do you know who spends a heck of a lot more money than the Koch brothers? And if you don't believe me, go to opensecrets.org. Open Secrets takes FEC data, puts it out on the web. You can look up candidates, everything. They make it very easy to read. You know who the biggest person is in America spending money on elections whose name you never hear? You're always hearing the Koch brothers? A guy named Tom Steyer, a big liberal progressive. Nobody ever mentions him. And the point of that is this. Look, I don't have the money that the Koch brothers do. Wish I did. Got 2 kids in college at the moment. But I don't have the money they have to spend on trying to influence public opinion. But that's why what I'm talking about is so important. Because the way the regular American person who doesn't have a lot of money, the way they influence things is they join membership organizations, pool their resources, and put out a message that way. They multiply their voices that way. That's why organizations like the Sierra Club, the NRA, have a powerful influence because they combine all those individual members to have a voice, and that competes with other people who have a lot of money to spend on elections like Michael Bloomberg.
I did mention Tom in the beginning of my presentation, and I don't think he or any of his groups ought to be able to operate in the shadows either. When we're talking about the impact of dark money, I do want to emphasize there are 2 different impacts. One is on the election itself and affecting who we are going to vote for. That's the one. It is most effective in influencing our vote if it is done through a nondescript group, the Kentucky Opportunity Group, whatever they were called, or Americans for Job Security, as opposed to NRA. We know who the NRA is, we know who the Sierra Club is. But it's the groups that we don't know where a lot of this money is going, and that influences our votes because we don't know where that money is coming from. And let me give you, here's a little anecdotal example. There was, especially like at the low level, there was a judge running for, a candidate running for a judgeship in Orange County, California, a very Republican area. This candidate was a Democrat. And so what happened is a group paid for a slate mailer that endorsed all the Republicans from President George Bush, on down the line, and then endorsed that Democrat judicial candidate in the middle of it without ever saying who he is or who's paying for that slate mailer. He got elected in a very, very Republican district. So it can influence elections. But also, just as importantly, you've got to worry about what happens after the election. When us lobbyists let lawmakers know who was behind all the campaign ads that got them elected or got their opponents defeated, that's when we actually start applying the pressure to try to get something back in return for all that money. And that's something that ought to worry everyone.
You have any other questions? Here we go, over here.
Can you hear me? Just a quick response. This wasn't actually my first question, but I kind of feel compelled to point out that there's a difference in kind between maybe an anonymous campaign donation and an anonymous source for a newspaper article, at least in terms of what would be generally at stake. That wasn't actually my initial question. I just kind of felt compelled to make that point. My name is Patience Burke. I'm here on behalf of Pundico, and thank you for the opportunity to hear your different points of view. I'm always amazed at the nuances that really exist with these types of issues, and it tends to make me a fence sitter on a lot of things because nothing is ever that straightforward. I have a question about the $600 million that you were talking about, the nonprofits putting into the campaign contributions. One or two questions. One, were the dollars directed at particular types of elections, or were they more evenly spread out across the country? And also, did the ideology of those different nonprofits, was it a shared ideology amongst most of them, or was that also more diffuse?
Well, first of all, important again to understand, you said campaign contributions. Corporations cannot contribute to political candidates, okay, whether they're for-profit or non-profit, neither can labor unions. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about independent political expenditures. Everybody understands the difference, right? An independent political expenditure is when that's not when you contribute directly to a candidate. It's when you do something like, if you want to take out you on your own want to go out and buy a newspaper, a page in the Miami Herald, in which you say to folks, you should vote for Senator Smith because he's a good guy. Okay, that's an independent political expenditure, something you're doing on your own. That's what we're talking about here. The money is spread out widely between different candidates. Now, what we've been talking about tonight are federal candidates. So we're talking about Congress and President. And the reason we're only talking about that is because the rules governing state elections, as you know, are different in every state. States promulgate their own rules for that. So the money is all spread out. If you want to know how corporations and labor unions, this is for-profit corporations, how they spend their money, again, go to Open Secrets. And what you'll find, for example, is that when it comes to contributions and spending and so forth, corporations almost evenly split their money between Democrats and Republicans. Okay, no surprise, right? Labor unions spend almost 100% of their money on Democratic candidates. And just a final thing, and this kind of goes back a little bit to what we were talking about before. You know, Craig Teague's talking about how horrible the Citizens United decision was and how it's terrible for democracy. Let me just point out one fact for you to keep in mind. The decision was issued by the U.S. Supreme Court in January 2010. What happened in November of 2010? We had one of the most competitive congressional elections since the 1930s. There was more turnover in Congress in that election than since the 1930s. I think that decision helped actually increase competition because many of the rules that govern campaign finance, they favor incumbents. That should be no surprise. They're the ones that wrote the rules. They hurt challengers and people who want to knock off incumbent members of Congress.
The outside money is getting more targeted. Right away in 2010, it was a lot of outside groups that were just for the first time having, a field day, spending money. So a lot of the groups just focus on candidates they liked or, for instance, only one candidate that they liked. But since then, these outside groups are developing the same type of professionalism that political party bosses have. And, the Koch brothers are hosting conferences to pull in together all these outside groups to sit around and strategize on how it's supposed to be done. Tom Steyer's trying to do the same thing on the left, although not with anywhere near as much money. They're becoming more professional party bosses. And the Brennan Center did a study on where the outside money was spent, for instance, in the 2014 elections, and found that the largest bulk of the outside money targeted very specific competitive elections. It was not spread across the board. It's being used just like a party boss would use this money.
I think we have time for one last question. Over here.
Yes, my name is Barney Bishop, and Dr. Holman. Okay, yes, my name is Barney Bishop. Dr. Holman, you said a few moments ago that you are a lobbyist and that money is given in order to be able to pressure a legislator maybe to vote the way that you want. I would tell you I've been a lobbyist since 1979. I've had more legislators vote against me that I've given money to than they voted for me. It is, in fact, a quid pro quo would be against both federal and state law, and I know that you know that. So to infer that a lobbyist simply gives money because we think we're going to get a vote, in reality doesn't really happen. It's a nice facade, and it's a nice thing to make people believe that lobbyists do that. But in fact, they don't. But let me get to the issue that I really wanted to chat about, and that is that there really isn't any reason why you need to know that I'm an NRA member or an AROL member or anything else in giving money to them, other than the fact that I'm not going to give money to an organization that I don't support what their point of view is. The reason why we should have some level of privacy is because when the data gets out there, it is abused. Let me give you a perfect example. It was but a year and a half ago that newspapers in New York City printed the names of everybody that had a concealed gun permit in Connecticut. That was an abuse. That's the targeting that you should be worried about. Not the targeting about the money going to it, but the targeting of the information that will be used, because the press and the left and the right, both sides, will use that to try to abuse us of our ability to remain privacy, but still make our contributions to an organization that's entitled to have it. It seems to me that both of y'all need to be thinking more about changing what the nonprofit rules are and what that threshold is, and maybe that's your bright lines. But we are entitled to some privacy, and we don't want the data in the hands of the IRS, Lois Lerner, or the New York Times, or anybody else. The Washington Times, a very conservative newspaper. We want that data to stay with us.
First of all, to explain the quid pro quo, I didn't mean to suggest that any lobbyist walks in, well, Jack Abramoff maybe, walks into a lawmaker's office and says, I've now bundled, $500,000 for your campaign, and that is purely with the expectation that you're going to vote yes on the bill that I want to see happen. That's not how us lobbyists do that. What we do is we just want to let the lawmakers know where the money came from that supported them. Very few of us, with the exception of Jack Abramoff, would be so foolish as to tie that quid pro quo to it. You don't have to. It has the same impact anyway. The second part of your question, which I find fascinating, because it deals on the issue of what should be disclosed and what shouldn't be disclosed. I don't want to know the names of members of the NRA or the Sierra Club or any other nonprofit organization, or a public citizen. I don't want to know that, and I don't think that ought to be public record. What does have to be public record is the sources of the funds used for campaign ads. A good way of trying to accommodate both of these objectives together is contained in the Disclose Act. And that is any group that wants to pay for campaign ads, if they don't want to disclose all their donors and all their members, set up a specific political account. And they only disclose those who contribute to that political account, and only use that account to pay for campaign ads. That way, the rest of the group's members are not subject to disclosure. That accommodates both the objectives here. It preserves anonymity where it should be, but it still recognizes the value of disclosure when it comes to electioneering activity.
Well, I just have to say that's interesting to hear that from Craig, because I've talked to lots of other reformers, and I'm sorry, but if you're asking for donor information, you're asking for member information. And particularly, the other organizations I've talked to, if you have a nonprofit that runs a grassroots lobbying ad or something like that, just using its regular members' number, the regular members' fees that they pay and donations, They want to know that. Look, this boils down to something, and we're closing, right? So let me close with this. The kind of information that so-called campaign reformers want from nonprofits, this disclosure of their donors, that's the kind of information that the state of Alabama was trying to get from the NAACP in the 1950s. And there's a classic case on this, 1958, where the Supreme Court said the state government was not entitled to that information because it violated basic First Amendment and 14th Amendment rights, and that such forced disclosure, the court said, would, quote, result in diminished financial support and affect its membership, and that was important to civic engagement. And if you think that's not true today, I brought along this study. Professor at the University of Massachusetts put out in 2013. Let me give you one final quote. He actually looked at if that kind of donor information is publicized, what would the effect be on donors? And here's what he said. Specifically, citizens who experience interpersonal cross pressures, defined as those who perceive themselves as surrounded in their local social circles by opposing viewpoints, are more likely to dampen participation when facing the prospect of revealing their preferences by giving a contribution. So what reformers want to push, the ultimate of it is to chill advocacy, to provide information that is unneeded for you to make a decision. This isn't dark money. This is private giving by American citizens exercising their First Amendment rights to associate and engage in speech.
Craig, to finish it up, closing statements? Go ahead.
Sure. Shall I start, I guess?
Yeah. Well,
I, like Justice Scalia, like the Roberts Court, like really the wide proportion of Americans, firmly believe in democracy, or to call it the Republican form of government, to be more specific, and recognize that it requires an informed electorate in order to work. If we don't know what's going on when it comes to the campaigns, and if we don't know who's paying for the campaign ads, that can shape how we are going to select our governors, our legislators, and our president, that may or may not be in our own interest. We may be unduly and unfairly influenced by the campaign ads simply because we don't know who's paying for them. But more importantly, perhaps not more importantly, but I really want to emphasize the second element of why it's so important to have disclosure, is because what happens after the election. It isn't just us being influenced in how we vote that influences the election. It's also the fact that lawmakers are going to be very, very keenly aware as to where this money came from that got them elected or got them defeated after the election. That is going to inevitably shape how they are going to approach public policy. You know, it may not be outright bribery, but it certainly is an undue and I think a very unfair influence over the integrity of democracy. You know, I was once giving a congressional briefing right after Citizens United, where I'm trying to explain to congressional staff, especially what the meaning of the Citizens United decision is. And at the end, I had one staffer raise his hand and ask the question, how do I say no now to a K Street lobbyist, knowing that that lobbyist is controlling the political budget of the corporation and can use that money to target my boss? How can I say no anymore to this K Street lobbyist? Think about that. I mean, we're not only letting this dark money essentially pollutes the quality of our elections. We are letting it actually start setting into the psyche of the lawmakers and their staff after the election. We must reverse this tendency. If we're going to hang on to our democracy, we cannot let this go unabated. I really do believe, even though Citizens United is not the cause of dark money, I want to emphasize the cause are the regulatory agencies of the FEC and the IRS. But Citizens United made that dark money a phenomenal tsunami of a problem for us and for the integrity of our government. I really believe Citizens United is a fleeting decision. I mean, these are all 5-4 decisions on the Supreme Court. It just doesn't have the gravitas of the Buckley decision back in 1976. But in the meantime, until we get Citizens United overturned, we've got to try doing what we can to hang on to the integrity of our democratic system of government. And that means getting transparency of all this dark money.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, both of you. I think we all are a little bit more enlightened about dark money. And I really appreciate it. I think it's been really thoughtful. And I want to give a special thank you to James Madison Institute for sponsoring this. It's been really great. Thank you so much.
And just in case anybody's interested, I did bring a couple of copies of my book, if anybody's interested in purchasing one.
So thank you all for coming. Just a few housekeeping items. By the way, I'm Valerie Wickbolt, Vice President of Communications for the James Madison Institute. There's a survey on your chair, the yellow paper. If you could just fill it out very quickly and leave it on your chair, we'll come collect it afterward. I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight and everyone that's watching online. We really appreciate you taking the time, and I hope you're more informed on this issue. Thank you so much.